Well, good morning. Welcome to the JTED Cost Reporting webinar. I am Amanda Wynn, and with me is Chris Cable this morning. In this webinar, we will be going over the new cost reporting requirements for JTEDs, new program codes that were added to the US of our chart of accounts to track JTED program costs, and we will also have an exercise that uses the draft reporting form to illustrate how costs should be reported for JTED programs. This webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes, and we should have plenty of time to cover any questions in that time. Please feel free to send in your questions at any time, and we may be able to cover them as we go, or we will be sure to cover them at the end of the session. If you have a question that appears to be unique or that requires additional information from you, to ensure we can give you the most accurate response, we may be contacting you after the webinar to follow up as needed. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website for future reference. If you did not already get the slides and the exercises from our website, the email that you were sent yesterday as a reminder, it had a link to those files. But if you didn't get them and you want to get them now, there's the web address there in the middle of the screen to type in if you want to. The exercise pages we will provide on the screen, but if you want to have those exercise pages to follow along, you can get those from our website. So where did this come from? Well, during the 2016 legislative session, the legislature restored $29 million of JTED funding that was going to be cut. But along with the restoration of the funding, the legislature changed Arizona Revised Statute Sections 15393 and 15393.01 to require our office and the Arizona Department of Education to develop and establish uniform cost reporting guidelines for JTED programs. Specifically, these guidelines, policies, and procedures must allow for the effective comparison of costs between JTED programs. Now, preparing these guidelines that go along with the statute change was a collaborative effort between our office, ADE, and school districts through many meetings and presentations. So let's see the results of this collaboration and get into the details of the guidance. The guidelines were developed to help ensure that the same types of costs are captured for all JTED programs to increase comparability. After all, if one district captures only instructional salary and benefit costs, while another district captures those costs as well as costs of supplies and capital, the cost between those two district JTED programs would not be comparable. The first step in this process was to establish codes in the chart of accounts to allow uniform cost reporting. Using the new program codes for all JTED-approved program costs will help meet the goal of comparability. The codes to look for in the chart of accounts are Program 300 and the detailed codes in the 300 series. There are also new transportation program codes 450 and 460. We realize that implementing coding changes take time, so the new program codes were added to the chart of accounts in June 2016. But they are not required to be used until July 1, 2017. We made the codes available early, and some districts were able to implement their use in fiscal year 2017. But all districts are required to use these codes for JTED costs beginning in fiscal year 2018. So before this change in program codes, all JTED and non-JTED expenditures for programs that statute refers to as vocational education programs, or often referred to as career and technical education programs, were coded to Program 270. But after July 1, 2017, the only costs that should be recorded in Program 270 are non-JTED costs. Those might be costs for vocational classes that are not JTED-eligible programs, classes at non-member districts, or classes at any district that serve students below 9th grade. Program 300 will account for all JTED costs that cannot be attributed to a specific JTED program. Those costs may serve all JTED programs or a group of JTED programs. Costs coded to Program 300 will need to be allocated across all applicable JTED programs at year-end for reporting purposes. We included notes in the outline boxes in the chart of accounts, and you see them on your screen, to help explain when to use Program 300 and that the 300 codes should be used with all funds, not just funds like 596 that holds member district monies received from a JTED. The list of programs in the chart of accounts came from ADE's Career and Technical Education Division. These programs meet the requirements to be considered a JTED program under the revised law. Each eligible JTED program has been assigned a unique program code. We also included the CIP number for each program to make it easier to identify the exact JTED program. So even if the name for your program differs slightly from the one listed in the chart, you should use the program code that corresponds with the CIP number for your program. The JTED programs listed are statewide programs, which are found in codes 301 to 368. Now, from time to time, programs may need to be added to or removed from the list. However, we don't intend to move any programs to a different code. We also include a range from 380 to 399 for districts to assign program codes for local occupational need programs. If your JTED has a local program, the JTED and all its members should assign and use the same program codes for those JTED programs. So for comparability, it is important for your districts to use the program codes assigned in the chart. So be sure to locate the correct program code for each of your district's JTED programs before you start using the new program code. If you have a JTED approved program that is not listed, you can contact our office or ADE's CTE group so that you can make sure that you have the correct program code to use for your program. The next set of program codes are 450 and 460, and these are used to capture all applicable JTED transportation costs. Using these codes will allow districts to track transportation costs for central and satellite programs separately from other non-JTED program costs. So similar to what we saw with Program 270, that after the effective date, no JTED transportation expenditures should be coded to Program 470. Only non-JTED vocational education transportation would be coded there. Member districts that transport their students to central JTED campuses should code those costs in Program 450. If satellite programs take a field trip, those costs will be coded to Program 460 as satellite transportation. You should not include basic to and from home and school transportation for member district JTED students in 460. Those costs should be reported in other Program 400 codes along with all other to and from school transportation costs. Now keep in mind that when you implement the new program codes described on this slide and in the 300 range at your district, they should be used to record costs in the accounting records as they are incurred, so that no allocation of these costs would be needed later for reporting purposes. So again, the ultimate goal is comparability. So along with all JTEDs and member districts using consistent program codes, we also need the same costs reported. Therefore, the program codes for JTED programs that we just talked about need to be used in all funds so that the total cost of a particular program is reported. So looking at the funnel here on our slide, you will see that one JTED program could be supported by the JTED Fund, Fund 596, a state priority grant, Perkins grants, M&O, unrestricted capital outlay, classroom site fund, or any other funds other than student activities. All of the expenditures made in these funds that support the JTED program will need to be reported in the JTED cost reporting form. The JTED cost reporting is only for JTED approved programs. That means that the program needs to be a JTED eligible program as designated by ADE, and the member districts need to have approval from the JTED to offer the program before it can be considered a JTED approved program and included in the JTED cost reporting. And finally, the JTED cost reporting should include costs for students in grades 9 through 12. There are two ways that costs can be included in the JTED cost reporting, either as directly assigned costs coded in the accounting records during the year, or as indirect costs that are allocated to the applicable programs at year end. Ultimately, the goal is to have most of your costs directly assigned during the year to to minimize the need to analyze and allocate costs at year-end for reporting. But we realize that getting to that goal may take some time. So on this slide, we have included the categories that are the current object code categories used in the JTED cost reporting form. If you implemented the new program codes, you'll be able to include most costs very easily. If you did not implement the new program codes, you can still directly assign some costs in the JTED cost reporting form. So let's look at how you might do that. The largest part of any educational program's recurring annual costs is generally salaries and benefits. So that is the logical place to start when directly coding costs to the appropriate JTED program codes. Based on district-submitted 2016 accounting data, salaries and benefits made up 75% of total career and vocational education costs. And identifying which JTED program they benefit should be fairly straightforward. For example, the salary and benefits of a culinary arts instructor would be coded to program 320 Culinary Arts. While salaries are the best place to start, and probably easy enough to identify by program, we know changing coding and payroll for so many employees takes time. So if you did not implement the new program codes in 2017, but you can look at your records and directly assign the salaries and benefits to report in the salary and ERE columns on the cost report, rather than doing a formula-driven allocation of those costs in their indirect column of the report. That would provide more information on your JTED program costs. As you look at salaries and benefits, keep in mind that when one individual work benefits more than one JTED program, districts should attempt to accurately divide the individual salary and benefits between the respective programs based on the amount of work done for each program. Then the appropriate share of the salary and benefit costs will be recorded in the accounting records using the appropriate program codes. The next largest cost area reported in the 2016 records was land, buildings, and equipment. So like salaries and benefits, these property costs should be easier to directly assign than some other program costs. For example, when you purchase a piece of equipment, it is often for use in only one or maybe two CTE programs. Of course, if you constructed a building, the cost would likely be shared by more than one program. But again, the assignment of that cost would be relatively easy to make in your accounting records and in the cost reporting form. The more costs you can directly assign to the programs, the smaller the percentage of costs that you will need to allocate at year-end, which should improve the accuracy of costs reported, and in turn make the cost comparison between districts and programs more meaningful. So along with this webinar, we have also provided additional guidance on our website under JTED Cost Reporting FAQ number 1. And here there is a recorded overview video similar to what I just went over, as well as a copy of the draft forms for JTED Cost Reporting, which includes instructions on how to report direct costs, as well as how to allocate other costs, and also discussing the reconciling the reported costs to the accounting records. And we'll also be going over an exercise that covers these pieces.
So you can see on your screen now a minimized version of that central reporting form sample that is along with FAQ number 1 for JTED cost reporting. The central page is going to be used by the JTEDs themselves, not by member districts. It looks a lot like the member district form that we're going to look at here in just a moment. What I'd like you to notice here on the screen is that there are arrows that come from the side of the form over to instructions on the right side of the form. We haven't duplicated that in large enough detail for you to read them here, but they're very easily readable on the actual form when you download it from FAQ number 1. You'll note that the instructions walk you through completing the Form B below with any direct costs and then any allocated costs, as well as then coming up and completing the reconciliation to ensure that all of your costs have been reported. As I said, this is the form for the central JTEDs, but let's take a look at the one for the members. You'll notice right away, like I said, this form looks very similar. It is, in fact, all of the same information that gets reported as far as the direct costs and allocated costs and a reconciliation. The instructions are provided. There are some differences in those instructions based on the differences between a central and a member district. On central districts, there's no exclusion of costs related to central programs. They'll include all costs except those costs that are paid through to their member districts for satellite programs. Those will be included in the reconciliation for a central district. Member districts, on the other hand, will include in their direct costs the cost of all funds, as Amanda explained earlier with the funnel example, but there are directions off to the side of the form that will indicate that certain functions, those expenditures, should be excluded from the member district's reporting. When we looked at the 2015 and 2016 data reported by school districts, we saw that very few member districts were reporting any administrative or other kind of overhead type costs for JTED or even vocational or career education programs at all. And we didn't want to have some districts reporting some of those more overhead type costs that really relate to their entire campus operations, not just their vocational or career education programs, and have other districts not reporting that information because that would make the costs not comparable. So rather than asking all districts who weren't already recording that type of cost to start allocating a portion of that cost, it made much more sense to have that very small amount of costs being reported by a few districts excluded from the JTED cost reporting by member districts. If you think about it, the difference between central and member operations makes this change or issue between the two make sense as well. On a central campus, they're only offering JTED programs, so including all costs, like those administrative and overhead costs, in an allocated way to all programs makes sense. At a member district, you're operating much more than just a JTED program on that campus. So there are a lot of costs, like, say, the cost of having a principal, that really don't make sense to allocate to the programs of JTEDs to see what the program cost is. That isn't to say that you can't have an agreement with your JTED that some of those costs are recouped through the JTED process. Maybe you do have someone who's providing significant services toward your JTED program, and you and your JTED have worked out that in your IGA, you will be able to use some JTED monies in support in those functions that are listed here that we're excluding, 23 through 26, 29, and all the 3000. But if you do have that agreement with your JTED and are making those expenses, you will exclude them when you go to fill in the direct and the allocated costs on the member form. Let's go ahead and walk through an example of how you would complete the member form, all of those direct costs, the allocated costs, and we'll touch on the entire reconciliation above to help you ensure that all of your costs in your accounting records that should be reported are getting reported. For this, we're going to use just a sample of 5 JTED programs, not all of the programs that you see on the normal reporting form. And we've condensed it down for just some space issues so that we can walk through it on the screen. Of course, you will have blank lines in between some of your reporting lines. If you don't have certain programs, you won't eliminate the lines for those reporting on the form. The sample pages that we provided on our website, the one is a page that looks a lot like this. I'm going to call it the green page as we walk through the exercise throughout, so that this is the final reporting page for the member district, since this is an example of how a member is going to report costs. And then in a separate Word file, a PDF, we had the 2 pages of basic data for this sample member district that's going to help us to define how those costs should be reported. You'll notice here on this slide and on the top of that form if you printed it out, that the accounting data we've provided has some shaded rows. Those shaded rows represent the functions that I just explained are excluded for member districts. So if there are costs in any of those shaded rows, we know you're not going to include those in your detailed or allocated costs by program. They will be included on your reconciliation just so that we can total up nicely to all of the costs related to JTED and vocational education in your accounting records to help us feel good about getting all of your JTED costs reported in the form. The first part that we're going to look at, as Amanda did earlier as well, is salaries and ERE, those employment-related expenses. You'll see in the example that we have 9 teachers for our 5 programs. Of course, that's a bit of a simplification, I'm sure, but we've also used some very round numbers because that makes the math easy too. So let's take a look. There are 4 teachers in the Nursing and Medical Assisting Services program. We haven't put in salaries or employment-related expenses for those. We're going to let you do a little work. 1 teacher teaches only in the Nursing Services program, and 1 teacher splits her time between nursing and medical assisting. So you can see we have 1.5 teachers on the nursing line, and that 0.5 teacher there on the medical assisting. We also have 2 other teachers that teach only in medical assisting services. For ease of math, we made each teacher's salary $50,000 and their ERE $10,000. Take a second and think, what would you be filling in the total salaries and ERE amounts in this table for these 2 programs? We won't make you wait long. We'll go ahead and click, and here we have $75,000 and $125,000 for the salary amounts, and the corresponding $15,000 and $25,000 for the ERE. So what you can take away from this particular example is, of course, it doesn't matter if you have some teachers that are teaching across programs. You don't have to now look at this and say, well, I need to report all costs by that program, and it will be so much better for me if it's only the number of teachers who are in that program. They teach full-time in that program, so I'm going to move teachers around. Certainly that's not the way to go. You want to continue with what you're doing as far as the choices you've made for how teachers are teaching in programs, but identify which teachers are teaching in each program, and then assign their salaries appropriately. This is really a place where the business managers at your district, who have a lot of knowledge about coding and the accounting issues, need to work closely with the CTE directors at your district, who have all of that knowledge and experience related to the programs that you're providing and can help to identify the teachers for each program. You'll notice then that we included in another bullet that salaries and ERE in function 2700, which we saw on the accounting data table, were for transporting students to central programs. So those will be included in our reconciliation when we get to that after direct costs. We also noted for you that salaries and ERE in the other functions support all 5 JTED programs. So those will be included in allocated costs after we review direct costs. If you have questions and want to send them in at any time, I'll just remind you that's wonderful. Go right ahead, and we'll try and get to those as they come, or we'll definitely answer them toward the end. Amanda, I'm going to turn over, in the green form, let's go back there, because now you've filled out your little worksheet that showed you what your cost should be. That cost information would just transfer right over to the green form to fill in for salaries and ERE for each of the programs. Oh, there's a little bit of something here you should note, right? When you look at the handout with the data, we had the programs listed as agribusiness, automotive, culinary, then nursing, then medical assisting. Good reminder to watch and get the costs from each program that you're bringing over on the right line. So we swapped those two around, and you'll need to make sure when you fill out your green form that you put the $125,000 salary amount on the medical assisting services line and the $75,000 on the nursing services. We did have a question come in on whether member districts have to report central campus transportation costs, and those will be included in the reconciliation. As I said on the third bullet down here, salaries and ERE and function 2700 that we're saying were for transporting to central programs, those will be included on the reconciliation on the top right of the green form in just a few minutes when we get to that portion. Good question. Now I'll turn it over to Amanda to go over property.
So we're moving to property next, even though on your green sheet it's not the next column, but as I talked about earlier, property was the next greatest percentage of vocational and career and tech ed costs. So we're going to move to property next. So here we've given you a table for the equipment and construction of buildings for the programs. And so we've also given you some blanks here, and we're going to have a little activity just like Chris did just now. We have construction on a joint use building for the nursing and medical assisting services programs that was completed in 2017. The nursing services program uses the building 40% of the time, and medical assisting services uses it the remaining 60%. The construction costs in 2017 were $1 million for this building. So in our table here, we're going to fill in the total construction amount for these two programs.
Again, we chose some pretty easy math for you, but you should have come up with those amounts.
Yeah, so you should have nursing services that uses the building 40% of the time would then bear $400,000 of that cost. And the medical assisting services that uses the building 60% of the time would have the $600,000 of cost. Now, when we go to the green sheet, you want to keep in mind that these pieces are combined into one column. So you will need to have both of these columns added together to get your total cost report on the green form. Let's look at that and how that looks. So then you see you have your equipment for your other programs, as well as you have your building costs added into your equipment costs for medical assisting and nursing services.
We did have another question come in that was asking that if the JTED pays only for some of the salaries for personnel, or in this case maybe some of the equipment that you purchased, but you are doing all of these costs for JTED approved programs, would you include the additional salaries or property costs that were paid from your other funds on this form? And the answer is absolutely yes. So any salaries or, in this case, property costs that are incurred for a JTED program, regardless of what fund is paying for those costs, should be reported here in the cost reporting form. It's a great question. There's another one that's come in asking about member districts only reporting on satellite programs. Where would you include the central campus costs, such as transportation? We will be getting that in the top right-hand corner where the reconciliation of member district costs occurs. So you're going to see that in just another few minutes in more detail. In the meantime, let's take a look at purchase services. That's another category for reporting costs on the JTED cost form. Here you'll see we've indicated that the purchase services in functions 2200 were for training the teachers in the agribusiness and automotive programs. So using the number of teachers in each program, we can allocate these costs to fill in the total direct purchase service amounts in the reporting form for these two programs. So if you look at the purchase service amount in 2200, we see $6,000. And if we look at the number of teachers in these two programs, we see agribusiness has 2 teachers and automotive has 1. So we have a 2/3 to 1/3 ratio using the number of teachers. Number of teachers is not the only way to allocate costs between programs. But in this case, since it was for teacher training, perhaps it's the best allocation method. Regardless, whatever allocation method you use, just as indicated in the instructions in the forms, you want to be sure to document and hold that calculation in your documentation to support the JTED cost reporting form. Before we move on to look at the exact costs that we report for each, we want to note our second bullet here that the remaining $700 in functions 21 and 2700 for purchase services supported all 5 JTED programs. So it will be included in the allocated costs after all direct costs are reviewed. Let's take a look then at what we can fill in for purchase services in the direct column. The agribusiness, $4,000 related to teacher training because of the 2/3 of the teachers being in agribusiness, and automotive technologies, $2,000. We did have a question come in related to teachers who teach classes in grades 7 through 12. What program would be used to code the 7th and 8th grade classes? So 7th and 8th grade classes that are related to career or vocational would be reported in program 270. They're not JTED eligible classes. They don't belong in the 300 reporting programs, but they are still, I assume, approved vocational courses. If they're not approved vocational courses, then they're just going to be in regular ed 100 program. All right, so moving on from purchase services, Amanda?
We're going to go next to the supplies and other columns, our last pieces on our cost reporting form. So for supplies, we're giving you information that the $8,000 of supplies that are reported in Function 1000 was for the Culinary Arts program. And then all the remaining $8,000 in the other functions that are not excluded support all 5 JTED programs. And so those will be included in the allocated costs that Chris will talk about in just a minute. And so we're going to need to move that $8,000 worth of supplies into the Culinary Arts program. And we'll look at that in just a second. So in the other program, or in the other column, you have $800 in Function 1000 was for admission fees related to field trips for all 5 JTED programs. And those will also need to be included in the allocated costs because they are not they're not easily directly assigned to a program. So let's look at what that looks like on the green sheet. So here we have our supplies of the $8,000 in our Culinary Arts program. And then the other column has nothing because all of those costs are going to be allocated. So next, Chris is going to talk about how to allocate those costs that we didn't include in direct columns.
Before we move on to all of the allocation information, you might want to think for a minute about supplies and realize that we aren't asking you to try to directly assign much in the way of supplies. There are certain supplies, though, that you'll find fairly easy to identify. In this case, we chose Culinary Arts. Most of those supplies, they're probably food, and you don't have food supplies for your other types of programs generally, so Culinary Arts and its supplies in food were pretty easy to identify and directly assign. Now, on to allocating any remaining costs. This table provides the allocation calculation based on a percentage of direct expenditures, excluding property expenditures, for each satellite program. So once you've already done the work that we've finished looking at for direct costs, you can total those direct costs, excluding property, because property in some years is going to be high for some programs and low for other programs, and probably does not have a direct correlation to the other kinds of costs that you're trying to allocate. You can see here we did the allocation for you. We figured the type of cost that needed allocated. We pulled some salaries and ERE, purchase services, supplies, and other that we identified as we went through as being in support of all of the JTED programs. Then we looked at the total direct costs for each JTED program, calculated a percentage of cost here by dividing the program's cost by the total cost for all programs. And after we calculated our percentages, We could ensure they were all equal to 100%. Then we used these percentages to allocate the total of all costs to be allocated. So we don't need to focus on whether the cost is a salary or a benefit or a supply or a property at this point. We just need to allocate this total $106,700. Based on these percentages, these are the allocations that we made, and we totaled that up to see that that amount agrees to the total amount to be allocated. Once you've identified those amounts, you fill them in the allocated indirect costs from all object codes column. Remember, very important to choose an allocation base that works well with your costs. We've used the percentage of direct costs because these are fairly small amounts that need to be allocated in comparison to the total costs of these programs generally. We've used very estimated numbers in our calculations today, but I think that when you see the actual information in your accounting data, you're going to find the same to be true based on our analysis of 2015 and 2016 data related to career and technical education programs. There wasn't very much. Remember, Amanda showed you 75% in salaries and benefits, 9% in property. That's already 84% of the cost. So there's not a lot left to try to categorize. That allocation by percent of direct expenditures could just simplify your process, make a little bit less documentation to have to hold on to, but still feel free to use whichever allocation base you feel ties more directly to certain costs, and just document how you made that allocation. Now we've filled in everything in the bottom portion of your green form, everything related to a direct cost or an allocated cost by program. So it's time to take a look at how we can reconcile that.
So the reconciliation's purpose is to make sure that you've included all your costs for your JTED programs in comparison to what's in your accounting records. So we had some things as we went along that we did not include in our direct costs down in Form B. Like, for example, salaries and ERE that was in Function 2700, we had $38,400 that were for transporting students to central programs. So that would need to be brought into your reconciliation because it's not a satellite member district cost.
On line 2.
And it would be on line 2 of your reconciliation on your green sheet. So then let's move forward just really quickly to see that $38,400 is on line 2, cost for JTED Central programs. So that's excluding that transportation cost since it's not a member district cost. Our next line 3 were costs that were not for JTED approved CTE programs. In our example here for simplicity, we said that all costs in the program codes for CTE in the district's accounting records were for JTED approved CTE programs. So in that case, we would have no costs reported in that. But if you did have CTE programs that were not JTED approved, you would put those here to reconcile your records.
Right. And that would not necessarily have to include the costs that you're going to have on line 4 here in a minute. It would be if you had started a program perhaps in your coding early in the year and then realized at the point that it was not a JTED approved program. If you did leave it in that 300 range, we'd rather see you get a journal entry out of 300 and into 270 so that way it's not getting reported with all of your JTED costs. But this first year when you might not even have used program 300, you have all of that together in 270. And if it's for a program of high school students that's not JTED appropriate, then you're going to want to put it here for costs that were not JTED approved programs on line 3.
So moving on to line 4, we had the district's accounting records include $27,200 of costs coded to the functions 2300 to 2600, 2900, and the 3000s in the CTE program codes. So those are the costs that Chris talked about earlier that we would exclude from our cost reporting in Form B in the direct costs and they would be brought in here in the reconciliation. Now, if you use the new program codes, you would then exclude those. Otherwise, you'll have to piece those pieces out of 270 and 470. So we get our total costs on line 5 to be $2,130,100. Now, in line 6, we're going to pull in what you're going to put in total costs from your district's accounting records to see that you've included all costs in your form here. Now, if line 5 and line 6 do not agree, you'll get the red error that you see on the sample form that tells you need to check and see why those don't agree. So the accounting records would be your vocational and education and career check ed costs that should be brought in here. And so when you get to the end, line 5 and line 6 should be equal to each other. So you know you have all of the JTED and CTE program costs.
Right. So in the reconciliation here, we're not just accounting for your JTED funds, the money that came from your JTED. We're accounting for all funds, any vocational costs, and we're either saying they've been reported in Form B below by putting them here on line 1. That's going to calculate automatically for you. Or they're not reported in Form B below for certain reasons, that they support a central program like on line 2, that they weren't for JTED programs on line 3, or that they were for certain function type expenditures that are excluded at member districts like on line 4. Once you total those and you make the comparison, hopefully you're going to see those numbers match up too and never see that little red message. But if you do get the red message and you have questions, you can certainly talk with your JTED. You can talk with us. We'd be happy to help you to identify where something may have gone a little bit off in the calculations that you used. But you'll notice that this 2130, we didn't pull it out of the air. It's the total on the top of the sample member district data sheet. Remember that accounting data that had the blue shaded lines? Right in the bottom right corner, that's the total amount, and it reconciles to those total costs. If you have some more questions, please go ahead and keep submitting them, and we will take a couple more right now that have already come in. Let's see, do we include expenditures paid for out of bond funds? That's a great question. The answer is yes, all funds other than your student activities funds. If you're spending in relation to JTED programs, you need to be reporting those costs here. We know that those capital property type costs paid for often with bonds or other capital resources do not stay consistent year to year. But that's why they have a separate reporting column in the property column in your direct expenses. And we would encourage you to get those directly assigned as much as possible, because if you didn't directly assign property costs, they might make your allocated costs look very unusual, right? If you have very large amounts over there. Even if you have to say that a building was built for multiple programs, you'd be better off doing that allocation separate from all the rest of your allocated costs so that you can put those property costs in the right column to help identify why maybe your program's costs went up or down from one year to another. That's good information to provide. We're waiting to see if there are any more questions that people want to submit so that we can definitely cover them for you today. We also have resources available on our website, that FAQ that Amanda mentioned earlier, the JTED cost reporting FAQ number 1, with a couple of short videos that walk through the forms and a lot of the same information that we covered here today, but those are available to you to use in shorter snippets rather than, say, perhaps watching this entire webinar again in the future or having someone else watch just a portion of those videos rather than the entire webinar in the future. We do have another question that's come in about ROTC programs at 7 schools. Some are approved for funding by the JTED. I'm going to assume some are not. So the question is, do we record these in Program 300 and then record the non-JTED approved programs in Program 270? Absolutely, that's the way to go. If it's a JTED approved program at one of your campuses, doesn't necessarily ensure that it's a JTED approved program at another of your campuses. It's often the case that they are the same programs across your campuses, but it is only appropriate to report the JTED approved program costs in Program 300. So if you do have a similar program at a different campus that is not a JTED approved program, you're not working with your JTED for that campus program, then the costs for the non-JTED stay in 270. The costs for the JTED one go in the correct detailed program under 300. Someone asked about utility costs. So if you're the central campus, utility costs are getting included. But at member districts, utility costs are coded into 2600 function-wise. And we saw, as we said, looking at the 15 and 16 accounting data, that very little, and I think we're at the range of less than 4% of all costs statewide were in any of those administrative or overhead type functions. So again, rather than asking all districts to start coding some amount of those types of costs, that would be a lot of work. We instead are excluding those limited costs that are reported out there to improve comparability between program costs across JTEDs and districts. Another question that came in was, can you give some examples of expenditures that would be reported in line 3 of the reconciliation? So costs that were not for JTED approved CTE programs. We had the question earlier about costs for 7th and 8th grade CTE type classes. Those would be included here. We also would include that other question about the ROTC that was not JTED approved. That would be included here on line 3. The part that's getting included on line 4 is only the amounts in the functions that are excluded for reporting. So those are JTED approved costs in line 4, 270 this year or in the 300s next year, but they're in certain functions that need to be excluded to enhance comparability. On line 3, these are not JTED approved costs. So that's the difference between line 3 and line 4. I hope that helps. If not, please follow up with a question. We'll be happy to address it additionally. So another question that came in is property cost just a one-time consideration for a new building? The cost of acquiring that building, building that building at the time is definitely that one-time cost as the expense is made. After that, any other building type of repairs or maintenance are generally coded into 2600 function, and for member districts, that is excluded. Again, we weren't seeing that member districts were actually coding those kinds of expenses in their accounting records often at all. And rather than requiring everyone to do it, those costs, if they are agreed upon between you and the member district and the JTED, could be in your accounting records but would be excluded from the reporting of direct and allocated costs. Another question, when is the green form due? So the green form, that cost reporting form that's up in draft form for 2017 on our website, is actually a form that's issued by the Department of Education's Career and Technical Education Unit. So they determine the timeline for reporting on that. I will say that I believe this last year the reporting time frame moved up quite a bit because the reporting time frame that statute provides for the Department of Education to summarize that information also moved up. So I don't know of it moving up again additionally, or if there were complications in receiving the data this last year that might require the Department of Education to ask for that a little bit sooner. But what I would say to you is, as you're doing your AFR and completing That, and then finishing out and totaling out your accounting records and finalizing any entries necessary there before submitting the accounting records to our office and to the Department of Ed. You should probably work on the cost reporting form at about that right time. Hopefully, the form will be released sooner than that on ADE's website so that you'd have a little bit of ability to work ahead if you can. And we'll be in touch with the folks at the ADE CTE unit. We have been through this whole process, and we'll touch base with them now, again, related to this question to see if they can provide any additional information about when the form will be issued and when it will be due. Someone is asking about the difference between member and central, and if I could go over that. The main difference between member and central JTED reporting is that the central JTEDs are going to report all of their costs, regardless of what function those costs are recorded in, because JTED central operations are just that. They are only for JTED programs. So all of their costs have a direct tie into programs that they offer, either centrally or by satellite. On the green type form for the JTEDs themselves, they have a reconciliation as well that lets them put the amount for any payments made pass through to their members to support satellite programs, of course, or even to support central transportation, as well as any things that they may spend on behalf of member districts to support satellite programs, so that those amounts are taken into consideration in the reconciliation on the JTEDS form, just like we take into consideration anything that the member district expends, such as transportation to central district programs, on the members' reconciliation. So the big difference is that member districts do not report those overhead administrative type of costs that are not generally directly tied to vocational education and career and technical education programs. If you have an agreement with your JTED, like I said earlier, you can definitely record those costs in those Program 300 areas, but they are going to be excluded in the reconciliation on line 4. Another question that's come in is, if I'm an actual JTED and have a satellite program and central programs as well, will I use the central costs on the central form and the satellite costs on the member form? So the JTEDs themselves are going to fill in the JTED form, and they're going to send their spreadsheets to the member districts to fill in for satellite programs. If by chance there's a JTED out there who records directly all costs of satellite for some satellite programs and doesn't pass through monies to a member that then reports those costs, then it would be, I think, appropriate for that JTED to fill out one satellite tab, one member type tab, to indicate that those costs are satellite class costs. But we can certainly follow up with that question if someone wants to contact us directly on that one for further clarification. But the idea is that the member district's costs are on a satellite, or for satellite classes on their member district pages, and that central program costs are reported on the JTED page, so that there is that distinction between whether it's a cost for central programs or for satellite programs. Another question that's come in is, if we transport students to a central campus, do we have to proportionally identify the bus driver's salary if the driver drives other district routes? So I believe what's being asked isn't about whether or not you have to divide up that transportation cost across your programs directly and get it into the right codes of 300, because of course transportation is going to be in either program 450 or 460. And when you use it for central transportation, you don't have to then assign it out to individual programs in any way, but you would want to be allocating the cost between that driver's responsibilities if the driver drives some routes for CTE Central type classes at the JTED and also drives some to and from routes, those should be recorded separately. So any costs for regular to and from transportation, even if it's for JTED students, would belong in the regular program code 400, 410 for regular ed, or then you'd take a portion of that person's salary and benefits and allocate it to the correct program 450 or 460, depending on the JTED transportation that they're providing. Another item was, would you include utility costs that are metered and billed separately for a JTED program or facility, whether the program is central or satellite? The answer is if it's central, it's absolutely included because that function is not excluded for central. If it's satellite, the issue isn't so much that you have the ability to find that cost, and you certainly can have an agreement with your JTED that it's an appropriate career and technical education JTED-related cost that you could code and use JTED monies for, but it isn't a cost that's going to lead to comparability across districts. We don't have every district with that same ability to identify its utilities costs. So even though those utility costs are identifiable by one member, they would exclude it on line 4 as it would be recorded to function 2600. And there was evidently a very brief sound gap for someone at the beginning, and are asking for just a quick recap of what code 270 is used for versus 300. So I don't think we can say it enough probably, because everybody has used 270 all these years for both regular vocational and career education as well as their JTED costs. So that is the separation. Many of you who are JTED member districts will not have any other vocational classes, so you won't have to keep anything in 270. But if you do have something that perhaps is Perkins eligible but not a JTED eligible program at your district, then you would have to keep that vocational or career education that is not JTED eligible in program 270, while then accounting for anything that's JTED eligible in the 300 codes. We've talked a lot about 300. The 300 code itself, as Amanda mentioned earlier, is for costs that need allocation later on. But costs that are individually able to be assigned to the direct programs under 300 throughout the year will save you the issue of any kind of analysis at the end of the year before you do your JTED reporting coming here in 2018, once you're required to use those 300 level program codes. There's a question about the 17-18 proposed budget forms and whether they'll require budgeting at the new program level. The answer to that is that you currently have on budget page 1 for M&O a lot of detail at the program level. Many of your funds throughout the budget don't have program level detail. But on that M&O page, we've had a section there with function detail that is related to program 200, special education. And of course, 270 has always been part of that. Moving into the fiscal 18 budget, that section is not going to be called just program 270 or 200 anymore. It's going to say 200 and 300 because still by statute, these JTED programs for career and vocational education are part of special education, just like gifted and other things that you might not necessarily think of when you think of special education. So that category on your budget is not changing. There will not be detailed budgeting by JTED program. They'll just be the same, 200 and 300 all together in one place, just like it was when all of your JTED costs were in 270 in the past.
That's Marilyn's answer.
So we got a response from ADE, thank you, Marilyn, related to the timeline for the reporting. And after the due date for the AFR, so that's that October 15th time frame, The JTEDs will continue to be responsible for gathering their member district data as in previous years, and then ADE has to have the full report completed by the end of December. So that's going to be the time frame that ADE is working with. So member districts, anything you can do planning ahead, JTEDs as well. Obviously, knowing you have this sample form, which is going to help you be able to fill that out sooner, but once the final form is available, you can fill it in member districts, provide it back to your JTED. JTEDs combine that all together, report it into the Department of Ed's CTE unit as quickly as possible after the AFR deadline in October. So there's another question about state and priority funds and whether they're expected to utilize the 300 codes effective July 1. Absolutely. All funds that are used to support a JTED program. Let me give a good example of why that's so important. If one member district had a certain career and technical education program before they joined a JTED, that program, because JTED monies are supposed to be used to supplement and not supplant, should continue to be largely supported by non-JTED monies, like perhaps the state priority grant or M&O or unrestricted capital monies. Then another member district might not have had that program before they joined a JTED. So they might have other programs they're supporting out of their non-JTED monies, but they might be supporting this new program for them almost entirely from JTED monies. If we look at District A, who had that program before and is spending non-JTED monies for it, and District B, who now has this program and is spending mostly JTED monies for it, if we don't have all districts record all monies related to JTED programs, then we won't have comparable costs. District A would look like it was spending very differently than District B if we didn't include those state and priority monies in the programs in the 300 range to provide that detailed cost reporting. So let's see, we have another one about the USFR. Appears to have been updated where Navy ROTC was program 374. Now it appears to be included in 380 to 399, and can we elaborate on that? I don't recall it being 374. That would have been below the local range. Amanda?
So I don't believe it was 374. It would have been in the 380 and after codes. But it came to our attention that there were local program codes that we didn't have in the chart originally. And talking to some JTEDs, the decision was made that we could have a range for the local occupational need programs, such as Navy ROTC. So you'll need to work together with your JTED and make sure that you use the same program code in that 380 to 399 range for the Navy ROTC between both the JTED and the JTED member to make sure that you're all reporting to the same program. So if you did use 374 this year and it wasn't the correct program code to use, then you could do a journal entry that would move activity there, or you could just go ahead and document in your reporting that that's what you did and that you're going to make sure it gets into the right place in the reporting form, and then start next year clean by putting that into the correct program code in the 380 to 399 range. Again, that wasn't a change. It wasn't a specific code that was outlined in the chart that should have been used because we only went up into in the 360s as far as any assigned statewide codes. But some of those local codes started at like 380, and we've kept that same range available for local codes going forward. So another question is, are administrators' salaries to be reported whether located at the JTED or satellite campuses?
So I'm going to assume that perhaps we're talking about a central funded, a JTED funded administrator who's perhaps, doing outreach out at the campuses maybe, because otherwise the answer is a little simpler, right? If it's an administrator's salary, it's going to be in one of those functions that's not going to get included for satellite reporting. If it's central campus employee of the JTED themselves who's doing outreach type of things to support satellite, then the central district is going to report that in their reconciliation as a satellite cost. If it's something that's related to doing outreach to bring students into central and they're going out to campuses and working, but it's still central related costs, that's going to get reported in central programs by the JTED on the central reporting form. Another question is how MOE, maintenance of effort, is determined under special education. If the JTED is to be included under Program 200 as special education, does this mean that JTED is also part of MOE? JTED has been included in 200 in total. In the past, it's been in 270. There is a separate subtotal on page 2 of the district budget, and I think it's page 3 maybe of the AFR, that gives information about your maintenance and operation fund, M&O fund spending related to the separate special education categories, where there has been before just vocational education and career education listed there, programs 270 and 280. We'll also be listing JTED in basically the program 300 range area there. So it won't be included in the subtotal of special education for the different disability classifications, but it will be included in the total of special education and all of those extras like gifted, bilingual, and vocational education where it has always been. Okay, I believe that's all of the questions that have been submitted. If you have any last ones that you send in, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar. Remember that the webinar has been recorded, and once processing is complete, we'll get it posted onto our website for your own future use or to direct others who might be interested in receiving this information to review it. We really appreciate you taking the time to attend today, and hopefully we've addressed all of your questions. But one last plug in there for business managers and CTE directors to work very closely together in determining how these costs need to be reported. The business managers, you certainly have that technique and expertise related to all the accounting records and understand all of the coding that needs to be done, but your CTE directors are going to be an invaluable, completely necessary resource to help determine where these costs belong in your Program 300 areas as you move forward. So with that, I'll close things up and say I hope you have a great day.